My presentation today is about strategies that, in my opinion, and in the opinion of some other students that I have worked with, turns out to be strategies that really work in their language learning experiences. My PowerPoint slides are available in my academia.edu page. If you feel that you want to get a copy, it's available there. I would like my presentation to be a little bit interactive, so at any point in time, if you feel that you have questions to ask me, just raise your hand and we can engage in a conversation. I'd like to start off by showing you classrooms in different places in Asia. Do you notice anything that is in common in all these 4 classrooms? Well, from the flags you can tell that one is a classroom in Korea. And then there's another one, I don't know if you recognize the flag there. It's difficult to tell, but that is red and white, that's Indonesia. This one is China, and this one is Japan. Is there anything in common about these different classrooms? Say it again?
They're all sitting down.
They're all sitting down. What else? Yes, and there are many other things. What I want to draw your attention to is the fact that what I find one thing in common is that these are classrooms in EFL countries, in EFL situations. And in this presentation, I want to make a distinction between EFL context and ESL context. Well, a lot of people use the word L2 as a generic term, but to me, after thinking about the issue for many years, I would like to make a clearer distinction between things that are happening in ESL situations and things that are or should be happening in EFL classrooms. And these are countries that represent the largest, perhaps, EFL countries in Asia. China, hundreds, maybe millions of students studying English as a foreign language. Same thing in Korea, same thing in Japan, and the same thing in Indonesia as well. The question I want to ask you is, what do you think about the success rate of these students studying English as a foreign language in those countries? High? Low? Medium? Wrong. It's high, actually. It's high in terms of examinations. The success rate actually is very high. Many, if not all of the students pass the state examinations, final examinations, and things like that. But if I ask you the success rate in terms of actual language use, the ability to use English for basic communication purposes, then the answer is a little bit trickier. Maybe? Yes? No?
Medium low.
Medium low. I would say rather low. I would agree with somebody who mentioned this years ago. And this observation has been confirmed by many, many other people, including practitioners, researchers, and all that. Robert Blythe-Roman from the University of Hawaii said this many years ago in a very nicely written paper called The Logical Problem of Foreign Language Learning. It's one of the most widely cited papers in the world. EFL situation, or EFL learning, is characterized largely by a general lack of success in the classroom. Some of the reasons, maybe? Very quick reasons why.
Test-based.
Say it again?
It's test-based.
It's test-based. Anything else? Usually, if I ask teachers, then teachers will say the students are lazy. If I ask students, students will say the teachers are not very good. I don't know which one is which. There are many reasons. But there's a small percentage of students who are quite successful. I don't have hard data or anything, but I would say about 15% of the students are able to acquire decent level of proficiency in the language. These are students who are able to use language fairly well for their general purposes. Again, the purpose of my presentation today is this. If we just know a bit more about what these successful students do to get to a reasonable level of English proficiency, maybe we can do a little bit more. Maybe we can learn from these students. Again, these are students from EFL countries. Let's begin with some realized examples. The kind of practices, the kind of things that students, good students actually do to get to a decent level of proficiency. I'll begin with myself. That was me many, many years ago. I come from Indonesia. It's a place where English is not used at all. Not now, not then when I was a young man. I didn't do very well in high school, I have to admit. In fact, I went to one of the worst high schools in my hometown. My high school diploma was not very much valued then. So, because I wasn't very good in math, I wasn't very good in physics and things like that, I decided to study English, like many of you probably did. And I signed up for the English language program in a local teacher training college in Java. My proficiency was very low, and imagine everyone in the classroom spoke English. The teachers spoke English every day, and my classmates actually, almost all of them spoke English. I was probably the only one who did not understand very much what was happening in the classroom. So for one whole year, I did not really participate very much in the classroom. I was there rather enjoying myself, but there's a lot of things that I didn't understand. When the teachers explained grammatical terms like the past tenses, the present tenses, and so on, I did not really understand what was happening. But then, I began to read books that I was able to understand very well. I don't know if you know the Perry Mason series. It's a very old series that I stumbled onto. And then I started reading and I began to understand what was happening in the story. And before I knew it, at the end of the program, I must have read about 40 titles of the same novel by the same author. And look and behold, I ended up the 3-year program with the highest GPA. And my TOEFL score was extremely high. Not the highest in the world, but it's extremely high. And I didn't know why then. I didn't know why I did so well. But I knew that I just did well because of the amount of reading that I did. You might think that this is a unique experience. It's not, actually. Let me take you to Turkey. Here is a student, a secondary school student. Her name is Cohen. She was a student in Turkey. And Turkey, as you know, is a foreign language. English is a foreign language there. Not many people use English. But Cohen is special because she was able to write extremely well. However, because of that, the teacher did not believe her. The teachers thought that she was cheating when she turned in her compositions. And this is what she said. The teacher wanted to know who had helped me write them. She would not believe me. She pointed at a few underlined sentences and some vocabulary and asked me how I knew them. I had not even participated much in class, and I was devastated. There and then, and many years later, I could not explain how I knew them. She said, I just did. Exactly like my experience. That's actually what happened. She became a reader and she started reading a lot of books that she got hold of. Let me take you now to Indonesia. Here is another story. Felicia is about 19, 20 years old. I know her very well. She would come and visit me from time to time in Singapore, although she lives in Indonesia. She's an avid reader and she has read some 200 English novels during her junior high school years. And what is interesting is this. She would read the same book again and again and again and again. Apparently that is doing a lot of good to her in terms of raising her proficiency in the language. She scored 570, which is really unusual for students studying English in a foreign language like Indonesia. I don't know about Korea. Maybe it's higher. Probably not. And she was an award-winning debating team. Some of you might think that, hey, maybe because she did a lot of practice in speaking, that's possible, but I don't think so. I mean, it's possible. Later I'll look at some theories that might explain some of the things that we've been discussing in terms of students' ability to make use of what they have learned through input-based learning. Let me take you now to China and look at some case studies of extremely successful learners of English. We're talking here about students who are winners of the National English Language Competition. So they're very, very good because they're competing against millions other students in China. And what they did, they spent hours and hours practicing. Is it practicing speaking? No. It's practicing this, doing a lot of repeated listening, repeated viewing of audio and video materials. The study was reported. I think I should encourage you to read the original article. It appeared in System by Ding Yang Ren in 2007. Now, what is interesting is what some of the students said, actually. At first, I was so slow in the beginning, but with the same tape, I had to listen to it many more times than others before I could follow it. But maybe because I had listened much more than others, I gradually developed some feel of the language. I feel that I just have countless patterns of sorts swimming around in my head. Lines from movies often naturally pop out. I think when she mentions the word patterns, she is referring to what we linguists and other second language researchers as these formulaic expressions. I think the evidence is fairly strong now that competent, good users of English have thousands and thousands of fixed expressions in their head that they can deploy, they can use it as the opportunity arises. So she is explaining a very interesting phenomenon that we linguists and applied linguists are just beginning to try to understand. Because of what I've seen happening, because of what I've seen that some students are really successful in their English language learning, I began to be interested in understanding what are some of the differences between the good students, students who are really successful, and students who are not really successful. I have some preliminary data, very preliminary at this stage. What is interesting is this: both the top students and the bottom students reported doing this. Now, if both the good students and not the good students are doing this, then how can we tease them apart and find out what is it that makes the difference between the two groups of students? Again, I have some preliminary data, nothing conclusive at the moment. I probe deeper. I talked to one of the good students, and I asked her to name 3 factors out of the 10 or so that she thought was instrumental in helping her develop a higher proficiency in the English language. And then I forced them further to tell me one factor. And guess what the winner is? Again, this is EFL situation, yeah? So talking and all that is very limited among these people. And the winner is this: reading. She was not very sure at first, but when I pushed further, think about it for a while, and she came down to this one factor: reading. I think reading is responsible for helping me develop a higher proficiency in the language. Now, for many years, I've been trying to understand the kind of theories that could explain what I have seen happening to me and to other students who are studying English in an EFL situation. Many theories out there. Actually, it's a jungle out there. If you are new in the field, if you have just started and you try to understand what is out there in the literature, you'll be confused. I was confused. I think I am less confused now. Still confused, but not as confused as I was when I was studying with Graham Crooks many, many years ago at the University of Hawaii. Graham Crook is one of my professors here. What we need to appreciate is that these people, researchers, experts, look at things from many, many different angles. And they come from many different theoretical orientations. And they talk about different contexts of language learning. L2, ESL, EFL, TESOL, and many, many other terms that have been introduced. And if you look very carefully, and if you sit down and reflect on what they said, actually, although they seem to disagree with each other, actually, deep down, they tend to agree with each other. But the sense that we get is that a lot of people disagree with question, for example, and then a lot of people disagree with many other people in the field. Yeah? But actually, they tend to agree with each other. For me, it's a gradual revelation. For many years, I believed that ESL is the same as EFL. Simply because I was an EFL teacher and I went to an ESL country in a university in the US to understand what language teaching should be like in an EFL country. So naturally, I borrowed a lot of ESL ideas and tried to apply the ideas in my teaching situation. Now I realized it's not the same. And the differences will have to be taken into account very, very carefully if you want to make a difference in your teaching, especially if you work with EFL students. Different target proficiency levels. Yeah? In ESL, I think the target is probably higher because the need to communicate using English is much, much higher. But in EFL situation, what would be a reasonable target? Can you give me a sense in Korea? Would you be happy if your students were able to reach IELTS 6? That's something like TOEFL 100 or so. I should be happy. I should be happy. In fact, in Japan, the government is proposing that teachers of English should ideally reach a level of proficiency at around IBT 100. Teachers, we are talking about teachers. So students, I would think, if they get up to IELTS 5 or 6, then we should be happier. So in terms of target level of attainment, EFL is very much different from ESL. I think we can expect higher target level in the ESL situation. Different teacher proficiency levels, I think that is very clear. I just explained that to you. And different opportunity to learn, to use the language. The amount of exposure is different. The opportunity to use the language is different. The resources are also different. Here's an example of what I think I was guilty of it as well. The wholesale application of the CLT methodology. CLT gave a lot of emphasis on productive language skills. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong. But I think when the students are not ready yet linguistically, I think we're doing a lot of harm to our students. Yeah? My position is we should let our students use the language, but we should not force them to use the language. In other words, speaking is not your enemy, but I think they need a lot more practice in receptive skills. Listening and reading. Another thing that we probably learn a lot in our ESL methodology textbooks is the importance of teaching higher order thinking skills like critical thinking skills, creativity, and things like that. After thinking about the issue for many years, I have come to realize that, hey, our job is not to teach critical thinking skills. Our job is to teach English. Our job is to teach the language. If you do want to teach critical thinking skills, if you're really, really serious about teaching critical thinking skills, you should do it in the student's L1, not in the student's L2 or in the student's foreign language. I don't think you can be very successful when students are still struggling with the basic vocabulary and grammatical structures in the English language, and on top of that, you want them to be critical. If they're not critical, it's not because they're not critical, it's because they don't have the language to tell you, to show you that they're actually critical. In fact, my experience has been that many of my students are more critical than me, if we allow them to use their L1 to argue back with you. More ESL ideas. Again, when I was doing my master's in the 80s, I was exposed to these ideas. Wonderful ideas. I fell in love almost immediately with people like, this is Joan, what's the name, Joan Rubin, yes, Joan Rubin, yes. She was very well known for her classic paper, the GLL, the Good Language Learners. And then Rebecca Oxford sort of followed through and did a lot of stuff on strategies and things like that. Here are some of the ideas that I fell in love in the 80s. But now I have begun to question the validity of these ideas. Still applicable in ESL situations, but in EFL situations, I have my doubts. Yeah. You don't have to agree with me, but I think I have my doubts. If you need convincing, invite me for coffee. I will sit down with you and talk to you for half an hour. Yeah. Here are some of the things that we have seen in the literature. Let's look at guessing. Is guessing important? Is guessing good? Do we need to teach students how to guess? My quick answer is no. Again, if you want more explanation, then we'll sit down and have coffee together. Try guessing yourself, and you'll find out that the success rate of guessing is actually very low. Even if you try to guess in your first language. I tried this many times. These are new words that I came across recently in my language, my first language, Bahasa Indonesia. I came across these two words in many different situations. I tried to guess, and my guess was almost always wrong. You can give it a try and see that guessing is a bit tricky, number one. And number two, you don't actually need to teach guessing because the students already guess all the time. That's how I now feel about guessing from context. Let me give you some examples. Pretend that you are foreign language learners, English learners. The target word is graph, okay? The target word is graph. Pretend that you don't understand English, yeah? Ji-hyun is not here. She is one of my Korean colleagues working at Ewha Women's University. Ji-hyun released a graph. You will find that a target word may be found in a context like this, and this is the kind of context that is known as non-directive. The context doesn't tell you actually what the word is. If you try to guess, your success rate is probably 20%, or maybe close to zero. Number two, the graph was slightly confused and then swam away. This is known as general context. The context is general enough for you to be able to say that, well, it has to do with aquatic animal, maybe fish, maybe a crocodile, maybe a shark, maybe anything. And then the next one is Ji-hyun has a graph in her throat. This is a misdirected or misdirective context. Actually, if you try to work out graph from this context, it will take you to the wrong path, known as misdirective context. The kind of context that we teach in the classroom is this. The graph is an excellent swimmer since it's an amphibian with smooth skin and has 4 legs. Of course you know what it is. And even if you don't know, you can make use of the pictorial information to make a good guess. Which of the 4 contexts happen in real life? Almost equally. Almost equally. This, you get to see this in maybe in encyclopedia or in ESL, EFL classrooms, but not in the outside world. Okay, now getting a bit more serious now. I'm sure you're familiar with all these 4 people here. He comes here very often. The next one is Michael Long, and this one is Meryl Swain from Canada, and that guy is not as well known, but I think he's a good guy, the Kaiser. The theories. I'm not going to go through or review the theories with you. The first one is comprehensible input theory by Krashen. Number 2, the interactionist theory by Michael Long. Next one is comprehensible output by Meryl Swain. And the last one, I think, is what is known as information processing theory or skill learning theory. I'm sure you're familiar with all these 4 theories. My question to you is, how useful are these theories for explaining some of the success stories that we saw together earlier on. How useful are they? Are they useful, not useful, maybe useful in some cases, but not in others? Let me share with you what I have come to think about all the 4 theories here. I think they are useful at different stages of learning. Again, I have no hard evidence, and I'm putting my neck on the line here because I know that there are some very well-known experts in this room. For lower proficiency, and EFL students, by its very nature, most of them belong to lower proficiency learners of English. I would say that CI, comprehensible input theory, and skill learning theory are more useful than the comprehensible output theory or the interactionist theory. Again, if you want to argue with me, buy me coffee and I'll sit with you and discuss this. I have some data, some evidence, not my own study, but studies from other researchers. The Book Flood project that was done many years ago in the Fiji Island. I don't know if you know this person, Warwick Alley. He's a very nice person. He's retired now. He's a reading specialist from New Zealand. In his study, students who received a huge amount of interesting reading materials, stories actually, outperformed students who did not receive the same materials but were taught using the audio-lingual teaching methodology. Now this provides some evidence that input-based learning actually is more useful for these students compared to output-based learning. Audiolingual theory is based on the assumption that if you want to learn language, then you need to use a lot, listening and talking. Yeah, talking in particular. There's a lot of repetition, there's a lot of asking students to produce language at the very early stage of learning. Now what is interesting in the study is that the students in the input-based learning condition actually outperform the other group in terms of their reading, vocabulary, grammar, and also writing. If you want further evidence, I would invite you to go to the Extensive Reading Foundation website. You'll be able to find a lot of studies, empirical studies and stuff that have been very carefully annotated and compiled by a group of people who are big and who are really enthusiastic about the learning of English through book-based methodology. I am one of the founding members of the foundation, and Richard Day, who was here last month, was for a couple of years the director of the foundation. Here is additional evidence that I think fits very nicely with what I said earlier on. This one is from Wong and Van Patten. They summarize 40 years of research, and I would go for this wholeheartedly. Let us read this together. The development of this complex and implicit linguistic system, that's the final goal, the ultimate goal of language learning, in my opinion, is not dependent on learner practice. Learner practice here, I think, refers to practicing the language, but rather is dependent on exposure of what is called input. So that is one piece of quotation. Another one is frequency effect. This one is from Nick Ellis, not Rod Ellis, but Nick Ellis. Nick Ellis is a second language researcher, SLA specialist. It's not easy to read his stuff, but I think I have one nice quotation from him. This is what he said. The real stuff of language acquisition is the slow acquisition of form, function, mappings, and the regularity therein. Does it remind you of anything that we saw early on? The forming of the patterns, meaningful patterns in the student's head. And this skill, like others, takes thousands of years. I think this reminds us of the development of expertise in anything that we are learning, including driving a car, learning how to play tennis and things like that. It's slow, it takes a long time to do. Tens of thousands of hours of practice is required. Finally, practical applications. What I like about Paul Nation is he is very practical, he is very sensible, and he knows how to write and explain difficult concepts into simple ideas. He has come up with what is known as the 4 strands of language program, like this. In any successful language program, you need to have these 4 components running together. Number 1 is known as the meaning focus input. This is basically this. Lots of meaningful exposure via listening, viewing, and reading. Number 2, lots of meaningful communication via speaking and writing. Next one, language focus activities, which is basically what grammar teaching is all about, and all the related activities where the focus is on the acquisition of forms, including explicit and systematic vocabulary teaching as well. An example here would be teaching students how to notice that all these 3 words have one component in common, that is the word rupt. Yeah? If you teach students how to identify rupt as being an important part of these words, then in theory it will be easier for the students to learn the other possible words that have rupt in it. For example, what else? Disrupt, abrupt, interrupt, corrupt, and many other rupture. Next one is this fluency-based activities. Again, what I like about Nation is he says this very clearly about fluency. A lot of us are more inclined to introduce something new every day or on a weekly basis, forgetting that language learning is actually about recycling, relearning, getting the students to become more familiar, getting students to proceduralize and automatize language items that they have learned the day before or the week before. It's a nice article by Paul Nation on fluency. Let's look at the 4 strands together. I think what we have seen happening in the classroom is this strand receiving a lot of or too much attention in our classroom. In high school, for example, a lot of teachers spend a lot of time doing language-focused activities, grammar teaching and things like that. What is an ideal proportion? 25% each? That's what Paul Nation is proposing. 25% input, 25% output, 25% language-focused activities, and 25% fluency activities. My suggestion or my thought is, I think we should have what is known as a variable focus. Maybe a lot more input-based learning at the initial stage of learning. Again, if the students want to use the language in writing, in speaking, that's fine, but that should not be your focus. Do not feel that you have failed in your job when the students produce, language that is not appropriate. Because at that stage, your job, or my job, our job is to get the students to acquire, to accumulate a lot of useful language patterns. And gradually, perhaps, increase the amount of output that the students may want to produce in their learning process. Okay, I'm getting to the end. My time is perfect. My timing is perfect, actually. Yeah, good. I'm so pleased with myself right now. What can we do to increase the percentage of successful students in our EFL classroom? That was the question that we started with. I hope you are with me on this. That we need to provide a lot more, exposure. I think in the earlier session, the speaker also asked that question, and there was somebody who responded, you need a lot more exposure to the language. And I hope we'll find more useful answers during this conference. Thank you very much.